Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. In this special edition, we're focusing on the working women the world tends to forget, the domestic female worker, employed by private households and who often operates without clear terms of employment. It's estimated there's at least 67 million domestic workers globally, of which about 11 million are migrant workers who find themselves in an even more vulnerable position. And some 80% of them are female. Now, in the wake of the Me Too movement, the International Labour Organization, or ILO, recently adopted a treaty to help legally protect women against sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. Let me stress, however, that governments have yet to ratify that convention. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Claire Hobden from the ILO on how that treaty will impact the rights of domestic workers. But first, Layla Milana Allen recently reported on the plight of migrant workers in Lebanon, many of whom are trapped in a nightmarish web of abuse.
Just days after arriving in Lebanon 3 years ago, Noura wished she'd never come. At 20 years old, she left her home in Ethiopia to work as a housemaid for a family in Beirut. But the father harassed and eventually assaulted her.
One time I didn't see him. I was in a room alone. I was cleaning, so he came in. There was nothing I could do. He said to me, "I'm going to have sex with you." He did the same thing 3 times. Imagine, every day I have the same fear.
Left alone one day, she escaped. But she had no papers or money. It's common for the agency to confiscate a worker's passport and take their first 3 months' wages as a fee. Since then, she's been living and working here illegally.
It's so hard to be alone here, knowing nobody. And with someone doing that to you, you can't imagine how hard it is.
She's just one of many who suffer here under the kefala system, which brings immigrant workers to Lebanon through private agencies. They should receive 1 day off a week, 1 week off a year, and a regular salary of $200 a month. But these rules are common practice, not law.
There's no written legislation at the moment about the sponsorship system. Every domestic worker who works in a house in Lebanon has a specific sponsor, and this sponsor has control of every part of her life, both personal and public.
As a result, foreign workers have few rights. Seeking justice is difficult, with their employers monitoring their movements. And if they escape, they can't go to the police in case they're arrested for being undocumented. A group of workers is trying to change that. They've created a secret social network to share experiences and support those in the worst situations.
Are we not human beings? Even if we go to the embassy, there is nobody to help you. That's why we're forming groups to help ourselves.
Recent headlines have helped their cause. Several domestic workers resorted to suicide this year. The resulting protests emboldened them to petition the government. But little will change soon. Facing a deadlock in parliament, an economic downturn, and a long-running refugee crisis, domestic workers just aren't a priority for the government. For Noura, any reform would be too little, too late. She's waiting for new travel documents and will fly home as soon as she's saved enough for the ticket.
Joining me now from Geneva is Claire Hobden, a specialist on domestic workers for the ILO. Claire, thanks for your time. What we saw in that report is sadly not just restricted to Lebanon. The appalling treatment of these female migrant workers is a common theme in many countries. It resembles modern-day slavery, doesn't it?
Well, what you're saying is absolutely true, that it's a situation that we see in many countries around the world. Of course, there are variations, and then it's not everywhere that you see the same exact conditions. The fact that it's called modern slavery refers often to the particular situation of domestic workers who have paid high fees to travel abroad, to work in countries where there's not necessarily a legal framework in place, where they don't necessarily have labor rights, and where there is this common practice, as the case we just heard, of employers or agencies withholding the passports of domestic workers. So the combination of debt towards the agencies, not having your passports, And being locked in households, which can sometimes happen, results in a situation of forced labor that is often referred to as modern slavery.
So what impact will this ILO convention have for such women?
The new convention actually is really revolutionary because it applies to all workers in the world of work, and it defines violence and harassment as those behaviors, practices, or threats that either aim to or result in physical, psychological, sexual, or even economic harm. So this is a really big change, and I know that domestic workers around the world have already seized the opportunity to use this convention as an advocacy tool to make sure that their situation is particularly visible. It's true that domestic workers are some of the workers that are the most vulnerable to violence and harassment because they work in private homes behind closed doors.
Yet it's still waiting to be ratified by governments. How quickly do you expect that to happen?
Well, the convention was ultimately adopted with an overwhelming majority of support. So we do anticipate that the convention will be ratified pretty quickly. But these processes are legislative, so the convention needs to be brought to the competent authorities, and there needs to be a legislative process normally in order to ratify it. So it will take a little bit of time, but we do anticipate that it will come pretty quickly.
Claire, let's just pause there for a moment, because in Ecuador, after years of abuse, domestic workers finally granted a union last year. It's working to uphold the rights of the 230,000 women employed in the South American country who until now had little or no recourse when they suffered at the hands of their employers. This report from Liliana Valencia and Emerald Maxwell.
In Ecuador, some jobs have long been exempt from all rules. That's most true of domestic workers, whose fate depended on their boss's goodwill. Alicia Lanchimba knows this all too well. She now lives in this indigenous community in the city of Cotacachi, but at the age of 10, she was forced to start working in a family that took her with them to Colombia.
I was told, you won't get paid, and if you want to get paid, you have to sleep with me.
Alicia is now a mother of 3 and works in the fields. But to prevent other women from being blackmailed, exploited or sexually assaulted, she's dedicated herself to fighting for domestic workers' rights. Nurali also suffered abuse at the hands of her employers. Now, thanks to the work of her country's domestic workers' union, she's finally able to recount her experience for the first time.
My bosses were hitting me. And I thought it was normal. When I was 14, they raped me. I got pregnant and they delivered my baby themselves. I was able to go to the hospital, but I almost died.
In March 2018, the National Union of Domestic Workers was granted official status, allowing it to influence Ecuador's public policies. One of their strategies is to educate employers that domestic workers have rights too. As an employer herself, Virginia Rosero is helping to raise awareness.
Many employers aren't aware of or don't want to listen or simply don't know the rights and obligations they have towards their employees.
From employers to trade unions to women's rights activists, women like Alicia and Nurali have recourse to more and more support to improve their working conditions. The fate of Ecuador's 230,000 domestic workers is looking up.
And watching that report with me is Claire Hobden, a specialist on domestic workers for the International Labour Organisation. Claire, the irony is that the reason many of these women are employed to begin with is so that wealthier women are able to pursue their careers while having families. And of course, with ageing populations these days in many countries, more of them are employed to take care of ageing relatives. It's a low-cost choice for families to employ such a worker, but how do you ensure that those families also respect the rights of their employee?
This is a very challenging question, but you're absolutely right that domestic workers really make it possible for women around the world to go out and do what they do in the world, whether it's working or continuing to do the unpaid care work in the home. And in fact, I think it's interesting because all women actually know how difficult this job is, how difficult it is to keep a household clean and running. And although it's a social problem where all of us have an individual role to play in recognizing that value, I think that it's also really important for governments to send a clear message to the people about the role that domestic workers play in society. So they do that through the adoption of laws and policies. They can do that through awareness-raising campaigns. I think that there are a lot of ways in which we can create the social change that's really needed to change the norms around domestic work.
But at the end of the day, it's all about a power dynamic, isn't it? And so frequently these domestic workers are in a vulnerable position to begin with. How do you give them the tools for them to stand up to their employer?
I think that there's a strong element of trust that we often talk about because it's true that an employer is sort of vulnerable by opening the doors to somebody who is at first a stranger, letting them into the household to take care of your most prized possessions. But on the other side of that equation, you have a domestic worker who is also taking a leap of faith by working behind closed doors in somebody's private household. So equipping them, domestic workers, with tools means not only giving them information about their rights, which is a fundamental first step, but I also think that it really means making sure that they have organizations to fall back on, so the formation of a union of domestic workers. But I also think that having rights, employment protection, social security, the right to choose your employer, basically. If your employer is abusive, you know that you can leave and enjoy the social benefits that other workers might enjoy already, without risk of losing income, because at the end of the day, domestic workers are doing this work because they need to support their families and their loved ones.
Claire Hobden, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for now. You can also connect with us via our Facebook page, that of course being France24.51%, or do send us a tweet at _51%. So until our next show, bye for now.